Hello and welcome to this Churchyard Ramble. During this week's Ramble, I'm going to be looking at sketches and images of the church throughout time. Now, if you don't know who I am, I'm Jeff Richards and I'm one of the trustees of the Friends of St Nicholas Churchyard. And I'm really pleased to be able to share this with you. And we can't meet in person. We can't meet in the churchyard to do this as a ramble. The weather's changed. That's not the reason, though. It's because, of course, we're living in an extraordinary time, a historic time. And because of that, well, we can make time for history. We can't meet in person because we still have to be alert. We have to be conscious about safety. And so we can't meet in person. Now, I am really pleased that we've got all of the support from Enjoy Sutton and the Sutton Civic Society for these talks. Enjoy Sutton, of course, represents 500 businesses in the High Street, and they are all waiting to get back to work and creating that place that we know as Sutton and the vibrancy of the town centre. The Sutton Civic Society is the society that really does encourage civic involvement. They're a critical friend of the council and are very interested in the positive planning developments around Sutton. If you are concerned about any of the aspects of Sutton, including the Heritage Action Zone of which St Nicholas is part, then please do consider joining the Sutton Civic Society. I'm going to be touching on a number of different topics as we go through today, and if anything excites your interest, then please do check out Sutton College's website, because they run an extensive set of history and culture classes that may well be covering some of the topics in which you're interested. So do look at Sutton College as well for those. You're probably used to the idea of St Nicholas within this urban landscape. The images that very often that we see of St Nicholas is surrounded by the multi-storey buildings of the town centre. It's a very modern urban setting. And photographs are a brilliant way of getting a sense of the understanding of where St Nicholas sits within the landscape. Here you can see where it sits relative to the civic offices. You can see where the Gibson Road car park is. And if we look in context of, say, something like a satellite photograph that you can see here, then immediately start to understand the importance of this green space that acts really as a gateway for those people coming from the Gibson Road car park heading through to the High Street. And so we see in this satellite picture the green space, and it's really obvious because it's a historic green space why this would be so important for the really the understanding of the history of Sutton. So that's its role within the Heritage Action Zone. But aerial photography, aerial pictures, they're not new. We've got these that date from the 1920s, and here you can see an aircraft has flown over Sutton. You can see here St Nicholas is in the bottom right of the picture, just in the bottom right hand corner. Towards the top centre is Trinity Church with its lantern spire. But over on the left is the church in the High Street, which was actually demolished to make way for Mr. Shinner's extension as he built out and continued the development of the department store that was so important within the High Street for so long. So we've got all these different resources for photography, and if we look at this photograph, again from the 1920s, what you can see is the church, and you can also get a sense here that really the church is set in a way that the development is very much to the east of the church. So you've got the west end of the church, where still large houses and large gardens are set, there's open space, and it's not as built up. The east is where, and actually the east runs through, and you can see over to the top right of the picture. That's essentially where, beyond the high street, that's where the Sutton New Town started to build up. But do you notice there's a building just in front of St. Nicholas Church? It's towards us in the foreground. It's a long building that is a barn. It's a single-story barn. And we can see that here. This is the tithe barn. It's called the tithe barn. Whether or not the barn was actually used by the rector of Sutton during the medieval period for the collection of the tithe offerings, I don't know. I think that's debatable. I've seen quite a few discussions about that. But what we've got here is nevertheless an ancient barn. And this ancient barn is significant because, well, it's part of the story of St. Nicholas. You're part of the story of St. Nicholas and part of the story of Sutton. You can see the construction, the flint and chalk construction, and it lasted until the 1940s, I think. In front of it, you've got here in this image, and this image is cropped to allow me to fit it into the presentation. And what you could see in the full image behind, you would see the spire of St. Nicholas. Here you can see a wagon loaded with grain. They've just come back from a show at Epsom, and you'll notice that it's for the Roller Flour Mills of Sutton. That's Dendy Napper's company, and it's a brilliant picture because you've got something that ties the very modern steam mill in the high street at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Very snappily dressed young man there, holding the cup, present, and the two workers on the wagon as well. So it's combining the sense that you've got modern steam mill with still an ancient mechanism of delivery within the dray. And Dendy Napper himself was a church warden of St. Nicholas, and here there is a plaque in memory of him within the church. Now, if we look to photographs that are early photographs, and this is a relatively early photograph of the church, and I say relatively early, we know that it's beyond 1864. It gives you a good anchoring point for buildings that surround the church. You can see over on the left-hand side, it's not particularly distinct in this picture, but I can see the white of the Gibson tomb over in beyond in the distance on the left-hand side of the picture, and on the right there is a wooden building, and the wooden building there is Lucy Green's cottage. If we look at another photograph of this, we suddenly see Lucy Green's cottage in much greater clarity, and this suddenly leaps out as very much your idyllic country cottage, and it is. It's a wonderful cottage, but it tells us something very, very important. Now, churches, and I think I've spoken about the importance of water in the landscape as to why churches are in particular locations, and churches have to be in a particular location, certainly from an early point of view, because of the need to have water for baptism. So you're not going to get a church built in a place where there is no water. And here on the right hand side of the picture, you can see a man and a little girl standing at a wellhead. So there is evidence right at the east end of the church there was a well giving access into the water. So as another point of reference to why the church is in where it is. And if you look over to the left-hand side of the picture, do you see there's a little group of faces looking over a fence? Well, those little faces looking over the fence are children, schoolboys, and Lucy Green's cottage was a school. What's very interesting about it is that we may well have a site in Lucy Green's cottage that was really not just a dame school into the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, but something that ties back still further. But there was in 1580, and I'm looking at my notes to just reminding myself about that, yes, there we are. In 1581, there was a chap called Hugo Price, who was not only licensed by the bishop as curate, but he was also licensed as schoolmaster. So Sutton had a school at a time when really, even before Cheam had a school, though Cheam was to get its school later on, and I mentioned that about Cheam's school in a previous ramble, as I've also mentioned about the importance of water and watercourses in a previous lecture as well, or previous ramble. I shouldn't call them lectures, they're rambles. They're not that. Now, Lucy Green's cottage appears in some of the earliest images that we have. Here you can see that this is St. Nicholas Church. This is the original St. Nicholas Church, original as far as this is the church that the earliest representation of the church that we know before everything changed. And actually this is looking at the church from the northwest corner of the churchyard, looking up to where the church was. The porch there that you can see on the north side of the church, behind the two gentlemen who are sitting on the ground, you've got the porch there that would have led quite directly in the direction of the manor house and to the rectory. The cottage beyond is Lucy Green's cottage. So we've got a good representation of the church in the landscape, and you can see that this church has got a wooden tower, and you can see the structure there. Now that is all before really. This is the church that people like Richard Mason, the Lord of the Manor, would have known. This is the church that his daughters Dorothy and Anne would have grown up in, and very much the country church that they knew. And as we approach the end of the 18th century, a new tower was added into the church. Again, in this image, you can see Lucy Green's cottage over on the left-hand side. And where you see things within the churchyard, with the railings especially, they give you a sense of the significance of certain tombs, and therefore they can provide a certain anchorage of where things are and where you can look. And notice as well, towards the back of the picture on the right hand side, you can actually see the tithe barn as well. So this is an excellent way of allowing us to explore what the church was like, what the architecture was like, and what the original church was. And here you can see a different view of the churchyard, and the reason for me mentioning and showing you this is that not only is this a very attractive church, a very attractive picture, actually it has some points lacking in it, and let me explain why I think this actually is a bit poor. It gets the building right, but it doesn't get the building right really within its landscape. You do see the Gibson tomb, although it's a bit sort of strange in the way that he's represented the Gibson tomb. The paths aren't quite right, and it's set in a parkland, which is all wrong. So you've got, for example, here, Sutton Church is set on as though it was a hill, but we know it wasn't. It's not on a hill. It's on the shoulder of a hill, but itself is something of a platform or a hollow within the side of the hill as the downs descend towards the north. The slope goes to the north, and the The other problems with it is that you don't see the tithe barn. You don't see the corner of Lucy Green's cottage. So he's chosen not to represent certain things. And also, again, if you think back to when I was talking about William Gilpin and the Dr. Syntax ramble, you would see that this fails to meet up to the standards of the picturesque in the terms of the picturesque landscapes that at this time people were drawing. You wouldn't get 2 cows in the picture. You'd have had 3 cows as the ideal of the picturesque. Not all drawings, though, are of the same standard. Here we've got a very good drawing of the old church. This is the old church before it was replaced. So this drawing would have been made around about 1860, because it appears inside the Church's Directory of 1869, so it's representing the church before it was demolished and changed. This is especially very useful because it's showing you gravestones that when the new church came, it gives you a sense of what may have been destroyed or disturbed. And if we look to now the next image that I'll show you, this is of the earliest photograph that we have of St. Nicholas Church. It's got all of the things that the artist's representation faithfully reproduced. And what's so wonderful about this is that you have got real evidence of what the early church was like. You've got here the tracery and the mullions of the east window, showing you that's the mullions of the verticals, and the tracery are the outline shapes. You've got that. We can trace that stylistically to a certain time. That's probably a 14th century window. You've got different shapes of windows showing different tracery and muller. You notice that there's actually a different level of window in the chancel of the church. So this is very strange. And then you've got the step as it moves from the chancel into the nave, and then you've got the tower at the far end, as well as chimneys being added in here for heating purposes. So you see the full development of the church, and the pictures tell us about the flint masonry, and we can tie any of the pictorial evidence to the descriptions that are contained within the various guides, the travel guides that were produced and shared about the environs of London in the end of the 18th century to the Manning and Bray's description of churches within Surrey as well. So when we have any pictures coming out now, we have anchors that put the church into a landscape, and we can use new pictures and new representations to allow us to understand where perhaps the impact of the new building was. So here, this is a very interesting picture because we can see the tithe barn on the left-hand side. So this is taken from if you like, we'd be in the what would become St. Nicholas Road, but what we're looking at here is we're looking from the south side of the church, looking towards the church and looking north, and we can see the tithe barn. Now, the picture of the church is very interesting when it comes to showing us how things change. So this is a fantastic representation of the building from the early 20th century, and you can see that Lucy Green's cottage is long gone, and what we see in place here is a modern house inside church inside St. Nicholas Road. The cottage has been displaced, but the other thing, this postcard is from my collection, is the postcards have a wonderful thing about telling you additional information that you didn't know. So you've got the vicar of this splendid building is very decrepit, and which is probably a very mean summarisation of about what the current rector or the rector was at the time that postcard was sent. Now, views that we might see in postcards or views that we might get from other publications are very interesting. As I said, it starts to allow you to see the church in its landscape, the landscape before now. And here you can see the fall of the land, the way it sits. And in this case, we are looking at the church from the north. So we're looking south. So we're on the north side of the church looking at this. There's a building in the foreground of this, and that's the rectory. So that's the rectory, and then we see the church beyond. It gives us a strong impression that this part of Sutton in the early 20th century was, or fairly early, this is the mid-19th century, I should say, and late 19th century is still very, very green. It's very, very vibrant. And we see that starting to change as we enter the 20th century. Now, I really like postcard collections, even though the colorization can be very, very odd. The way in which people interpret the photographs and then try and render it with some sort of color within the printing process, like flint is not an orange colour, but I'm particularly fond of this postcard. As we go through, I really like this. It's showing you the greenery, it's showing you the wall, it's showing you features that you may not have known existed. So we see the shape really of the churchyard here very, very clearly. And as we step on, if I step onto this picture, this contains not only information about the church architecture, the location of gravestones, not only telling you about the way in which shrubs and trees were managed, but interestingly here, and also you can see that this is a colorized picture, and I particularly like the startling red of the lamppost. That is true artistic license. That's where the artist has not known what colour lampposts are, so they've painted them red. You've got a hint here of where that sensibility may come from, because you notice that this postcard has been printed in Germany. So it's come from a company that is offices and print works in Dresden and in Berlin. So it's come from Prussia. And that's a very useful reminder of the strong international links that Sutton had. You've got books of Old Sutton with memories by people like Robert Smith, who talk about the German Umpapa bands coming before the beginning of the First World War. There was travel from the continent and very strong sense of internationalism and European trade. We also get other social indicators about how the church is still fitting into its landscape. If we look here at this picture, we see two really startling bits of information. The first is that the road is now named. The road, as the town grew, you needed to allow people to find their way around. You couldn't just point somebody and say, "It's go down to the road where the church is." You end up with knowing that it's St. Nicholas Road that you have to send somebody to. And people are not always going into the churchyard to look at the notices. The notice board has now been brought away from the church porch where notices would be pinned to a notice board that is at the front of the church. So very much where people are seeing it as they pass by. There are other sort of interesting changes to the church. Again, you can see the house that replaced Lucy Green's cottage on the right, but here you can see there's suddenly a flagpole. Flagpoles probably added around 1910 ahead of the coronation of George V. But it's also quite, I sort of have a smile about it because it starts to indicate that really they'd worked out that they needed to put guy ropes on very, very quickly because, well, because flagpoles that large need to have guy ropes. And what's interesting is that you can still go and see the foundations, the anchor point for the flagpole within the churchyard. The flagpole became a very strong feature of the church, and you can see the flagpole feature here. This is another Edwardian picture. You can see also as well, I think, some questions about the state of the roof at some point, so there must have been some repair done there. But this is now still St Nicholas Road, but which would have become, now if you can think of it, as we're looking north along St Nicholas Way, we're trying to get a sense of what the road was like. You see the trees that are on the left-hand side. We see how they're growing, and actually we can see here just a little bit later on how the roof, how the trees have changed. What you've got is a different season. So this is taken in the winter. You've got the road, and you've got the white gate, and the white gate would lead to the tithe barn. Now, I really like that sense of being able to get a sense of what was growing, and therefore how old certain trees and certain plants are within the churchyard. Now, this does make me a little grumpy at times. You can see here a wonderful shaped yew tree that is outside the vestry. Now, what we're looking at here is the vestry. So imagine we're now on the north side of the church. In the north, we're in the northeast corner. We're in the northeast corner of the churchyard, outside the vestry, and there is this yew. You would not recognise this now. The yew is humongous. It has grown into a full tree rather than being managed into this nice shape. There has been an abandonment really to allow trees to take over instead of being. And I know why they were planted was because as the surrounding became more and more urban, there was a reaction to try and beautify with greenery what was an open churchyard with new shrubs and things. Now, we do get a timeline of how the churchyard has changed, how the trees have grown, and we get a sense as well of what has changed in terms of the monuments. So here, for example, I can detect there are railings around a couple of the tombs, which no longer have railings around them. We can see the state of stonework within the church at any time as well. Sometimes it can be surprising that some things that church wardens consider to be a modern problem actually is pretty ancient in terms of the sense of the condition of the building, that they've almost been baked into the building's architecture. But all these photographs allow us to get anchor points around the tombs which have got railings on them, which allow us to get a sense of where trees are, and we see a full sense. We can almost do, using postcards, using the old photographs, we can go a whole circuit round the building. And it's useful here, for example, in this photograph, this is now taken from the northwest corner, and I can see railings around what is the Talbot tomb. I can see railings around the Hall family tomb as well. We can see which which tombs and which monuments are missing. So, for example, I know from here that we've got a missing tombstone, completely missing. If we go into the churchyard and have a walk around, it's no longer there. We can see how monuments start to be affected by the trees as they grow up, and they've been allowed to grow up. And I know I can sound grumpy because I complain about the shrubbery gradually swallowing some of the monuments, and that's a by the by, really. That's just the way it is. But the reluctance, at least I have the comfort of knowing that the reluctance to prune vegetation seems to go back right to the beginning of the 20th century. We are nevertheless hugely fortunate in being able to use images like this to trace the story of St. Nicholas, and therefore the stories of the monuments and stories of monuments are the stories of people. We're able to trace those stories from their earliest point all the way through to the present day. And if we roll back to where we started from and look at really the earliest image, then we can go back again in the northwest corner of the churchyard and get a sense of how much St. Nicholas has changed from when it was a village of 100 souls through to now the town centre of hundreds of thousands of people who live in Sutton. There are something like 8,000 just within the immediate area of the church. Now, I've intended to inform, to educate and hopefully entertain you in this ramble, and so we are coming to the end of this trip around the churchyard. You can see the older rambles, the previous rambles, up on the YouTube site. You can go onto YouTube and you can look for Churchyard Rambles. You can look for the Friends of St. Nicholas Churchyard. Please do find those. Please do have a look at those rambles. And any of the points that I have raised as we've talked through here, we've looked at urban development, we've touched on the idea of architectural change. Any of those topics, you can have a look at Sutton College's history and culture classes. So go and check out suttoncollege.ac.uk for those. Next week's ramble is going to be looking at the story of Henry Witch, and he's a man who lived at during a period that we might think was we think our time is extraordinary. His time was unbelievable. He was Sutton's own Vicar of Bray, because he went through the period of Charles I, through to the interregnum, through to the Commonwealth, the Protectorate, and then back to the era of Charles II and the Restoration. This is an extraordinary story. Please do join me next week for that little story. But here we are at the end of today's ramble. So I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you for joining me. So long, Sutton. Your history.